Welcome everybody to today's March 4th brown bag meeting. Like I mentioned earlier, we have a pretty full agenda today. We are lucky to have on the call today Auditor John Dougal, our state auditor, not the one that's mentioned on there. Our state auditor's name has two L's, and we're so lucky to have John Dougal here today to present to us. He is a great state auditor. I've mentioned it before that he usually looks to educate, him and his team look to educate us on what needs to be improved on the state and not look to punish us. And over the last year, him and his team have worked tremendously to put out a report on software procurement. And I think this is something that is becoming more and more relevant to us as procurement officials in the procurement of IT and software. And he will be able to provide us with ways of looking at what we should be looking for and principles. If anybody is looking for the auditor's report, it is on our front webpage, which you can download, and it is very helpful. Solomon and the auditor will be able to go over those. Following their report and their presentation, I will be providing some updates to the Utah administrative rules, and I will be discussing any legislation that's going through at this moment. So I will turn the time over to now John Dougal and Solomon Kingston.
Well, Chris, thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction. It's always a pleasure to work with you and your team. We collaborate a lot because part of our job is to deal with enforcement issues and identify certain weaknesses in procurement practices around not just the state, but local governments as well. So appreciate your wonderful team. It's good to be with you. Let me go back in time a little bit. And first thing, if you have questions as we go along, I think feel free to type them over in the chat or somehow let Solomon know that you have questions. Happy to answer those as we go along. I also have with me Nicole Davis from my office, who was point person on working through a lot of these issues. Roll back about a year ago, we publicly started hearing about a company called Banjo, and probably many of you heard about them in the news. Well, in the April-May timeframe, it started landing in my lap. And some of the issues that were presented were concerns about the magnitude of data that was being collected, concerns about privacy given the representations of the type of data and the way they were using that data, and then some information about the founder and his childhood caused people concerns when it came to discrimination and whether there was intentional or unintentional bias built into their system. As a result of that, the Attorney General asked me to look into this system. They had contracted for this system, and the purpose of it is a very noble purpose. It was touted as a tool that especially would help in child abduction. And you know, society would pay just about any amount of money to rapidly and quickly and safely recover a kidnapped child. And so this was pitched as a tool that was going to basically take what was taking officers hours to days to accomplish when successful and take it down into potentially minutes. And as they started going down this path, I mean, you think about in society, we talk a lot about artificial intelligence and machine learning and how these new software tools are going to revolutionize what's going on, and they're going to be smarter than we are, and they're going to have all this power. Well, with that comes various risks and concerns, and I formed a commission back in June. While my office had done some audits and reviews of sensitive information and privacy concerns, such as in the controlled substance database, as well as the driver's license database and other things like that, we had never really looked at algorithmic bias. And so I wanted to get some of the best and brightest minds in Utah and appointed 9 people to a commission to look at these issues of privacy, to look at these issues of anti-discrimination, to help us better target how we looked into this procurement activity with Banjo, and to give us their best insights. Well, one of the first things we noticed as we got into it, we were meeting with this company, we were getting information. And as we were proceeding through the process, it was, boy, there's a lot of questions that existed. There's a lot of things that, not just in this case, the Attorney General's office encountered, but there are likely issues that governmental entities throughout the state would bump into as they're dealing with more sophisticated software, more powerful tools that claim to do certain things or might actually do them. There's probably a lot of questions that folks are unaware of. There's going to be various pitfalls that folks are going to encounter. And so the commission thought it would be very helpful to put out a set of principles and associated questions. There's oftentimes things you don't know. And part of the purpose of these principles and associated questions is to help government procurement officials, as well as those within the various entities and agencies, start to recognize some of the key questions they should probably be asking so they can be better informed as they make the procurement decisions about what type of software to implement, to deploy, to engage. And while I brought up the case with the Attorney General's Office of Child Abduction, you could think about vendors out there claiming different tools that deal with facial recognition that might be helpful in law enforcement. You might deal with things of vehicle recognition when it comes to stolen cars, deals with cars that have not been properly registered, other things like that. You can even look at things potentially that deal with educational enhancement, tools to help improve the learning process, whether in public ed or higher ed. So you can envision a whole array of different kind of tools and technologies that we're going to be experiencing as society. And we wanted to help government officials be better informed as they go down those paths, to try and learn from previous missteps. I tell folks that, you can either learn from others' mistakes or be the example that others learn from. I find the latter is easier than the former. But it's one of those things of trying to help folks better understand some of these issues and some of these risks going forward. With that, I'm not sure, Solomon, if there's any questions right now, but we can go to Nicole and have Nicole discuss the 12 principles that the commission recommended to folks.
There are no questions, so yes, let's turn it over to Nicole.
Hi, can you all hear me? I guess give me the thumbs up or something if you can hear me okay.
Yep, we can hear you great.
Perfect. I'm actually running two machines, so just give me a second. I'm going to share my other screen and put the principles up. All right, so hopefully that is going to pop up here in just a second. All right, beautiful. So if I look away, it's not that I'm not looking at you, I'm just scrolling our principles document. Let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger and see if it will show a little bit better on your screens. So thank you for the time. Thanks to Auditor Dougal, and thank you for purchasing, for inviting us to participate. We've obviously spent a lot of time on this, and really I want you to know that we had you all in mind every step of the way, because these principles and the questions are really designed to help you as you navigate, as John laid out, this increasingly complex landscape. And we're going to go through the principles, but there are companion questions, that second document that Solomon has put in the chat box. Those questions are really meant for you as you look at doing an RFP, whether you're on the agency side or the purchasing side, really kind of meant to be cut and paste. You can say, yep, that principle applies, and here's these questions, and you can put that in the RFP with the goal that they really help elevate the conversation with potential vendors. Now, as we go through this, some of it's very common sense, and some of it is very technical. And the commission, as John's indicated, composed of really tremendous experts in these fields, and we really appreciated all of their time and expertise. We've had the conversation that not every agency will have all of that expertise at any given time, and we get that. So we know that sometimes you might put the questions in an RFP and think, well, if they come back with an answer, how am I going to know if it's a good answer? But we really felt that setting the bar where it needs to be is really important, so that this will put vendors on notice that Utah is serious about protecting its citizens' privacy and protecting them from discrimination embedded in technology. So we think it's a really tremendous first step. And we also think that over time, obviously, we'll build collective capacity around all of this. So we'll touch on some of the questions, but it's actually quite a lengthy document, so I invite you to read it if you got a little need to go to sleep or something. But here's the first principle. Limit the sharing of sensitive data. And this one's common sense. But in fact, we know, for example, from the banjo episode, that sometimes more data is shared or collected than needs to be. It's sort of like, hey, why not? Let's gather it up. But by gathering it and by sharing it, we do put it at risk because, of course, governments are targets. So that's the first one. And this is sort of an introspective question for an agency or a state or government entity to contemplate. Is this needed? All right. And then again, minimizing the data collection and accumulation. So when you look at a vendor and they say, we collect everything and we keep it forever, that's not actually a good thing because again, it puts our citizens at risk. And so we want to set that bar with those vendors that, hey, we want to focus, whatever our need is, whatever we're trying to satisfy in terms of a need, then we want to just collect the data that is necessary for accomplishing that job or that mission. I'm going to scroll here just a second. Now, this is an important one, and this one is not trivial, but it's important for us to validate the technology claims. There's a lot of marketing out there, and being in the AI field, which I am, and Auditor Dougal is also a technologist, we see a lot of companies who are advertising, oh, we have AI. And to be honest, we take it very skeptically. There are many companies who are just adopting, we're cool, we're adopting phrases, making marketing claims that's not really backed up. So the commission really felt it's very important that they better be able to demonstrate to you and demonstrate to an expert that they really are using some of these technologies. And some of these that are particularly sensitive because they put our citizens at risk, right? AI or ML, multiple data sources, and particularly around social media. Because in fact, a press article, a press request from a reporter appeared on my desk the other day. And what he wanted to know was startups that were using scraping tools to basically steal training data information for their AI systems. And that, in fact, is a common way, so that companies are getting personal information without permission. And one of the questions is, do you have written permission from every person included in your training data set? Many vendors today who have, who are well known would not be able to pass that because that's a high bar of integrity and ethics. But it's an important one. So these are some of the examples. And this issue of real-time capabilities, right? This is very appealing, particularly in some of our applications as a state, right? Real-time. But the truth is there are always delays. By definition, when you're collecting data, when you're integrating data, when you're analyzing data, there are always delays. And so when an entity says, oh, it's real time or live time, right? We heard that phrase. Be skeptical and really demand that validation.
Nicole alluded to this, but when there's all these companies out there, these vendors with cutting edge technology, oftentimes they're pitching a vision before they actually have reality, and thus the importance of validating those claims. They're hoping to do something. They're selling investors and others on that vision, but it may not be reality. And it may not actually come to fruition. And so that's part of the reason of understanding those risks. In the case of the banjo system, they did a little pilot example. They did a mock child abduction, and they do these exercises regularly to keep folks trained and understand how to approach it. And then they had the banjo system running off to the side, and they thought that it had performed quickly. But in questions to them, they hadn't really validated what had happened and to what extent the machine had really made the decision versus an intelligent analyst sitting there. And so that's the importance of saying, okay, folks are selling a certain vision. They're selling a vision of a certain capability, a certain technology, but it's incumbent on those procuring it to really validate it. So.
Yeah, excellent. That's a really excellent point. And in fact, there are some investors in AI who encourage their startups to get a big contract and then use that as a way of collecting the data. So really that they have almost nothing. So again, that emphasis on what do they really have. And then number 4 is somewhat related, but it's on an ongoing basis.
Nicole and John,
yeah,
I would like to just add to that point of, I think we do need to look at our procurement processes to identify how we are going to validate those claims, how we are going to validate those data, that data that they're providing to us, because it is something that I don't think traditional methods would normally catch. If we're just going out for, say, a bid and we're relying only on the low cost, we're not going to have a chance to validate a lot of those claims because we're just looking at cost. Even in a traditional RFP instance where we just go out and ask the vendors to provide proposals back to us, is we're relying more on their verbiage, and a lot of times those keywords and I'll say it, those sexy words of AI and other new technology that we think is cutting edge, and if we don't have them, we're going to be missing out. Those can be floated as scoring one vendor higher than another. There was an instance in my division where we had one of my employees travel with an agency to I think 3 different places, a place in Canada, a place in Michigan, and I can't remember the other place, to validate some of the claims by the vendors that were submitting responses, and they were going out to the real world applications of those to see how, in this instance, a radio system worked. And when my employee got back, he even commented of the vendors got to choose their best location for their radios, and one of the locations the vendors failed because they had too much static, or there was too many there was a delay in how it was being communicated. And it was nice for that group to be able to see that and see how it was going to be applicable here in Utah.
Well, and Chris, going to a real world example from my past history, I worked for a company. We built radar sensors. And, if you just looked at the words, certain things looked great, and people might not be able to deliver on the words that they put in the proposal versus actually performing. We had one competitor who they would ask an entity they were selling to a location to install their radar sensor, and then would take several days to install it, get it all configured, ready for a demo. With our product, it had certain technology, and we would show up and say, where would you like us to do it? And right there with them watching, we would install and immediately perform tests for them at whatever location they chose. And so it was really putting us through our paces to say, yes, we can actually deliver on what we said.
And I think that's a very good example because, and something to always look for in what we're doing, and this can be applied, is what are they putting in their proposal, and then what are they allowing to go into their contract?
Yeah.
These vendors fully understand that if it's not in the contract, they're not bound by it. Yeah. So they can put whatever they want in their proposal to try and win. But if they're trying then to take out some of those terms or some of those metrics, whatever that they are saying, then we do need to become very we have to look at that in a different light and hold the vendors accountable to what is in their proposal and making sure that that's what's going to be in their contract and what they're going to be held responsible for.
Yeah, we could call it the talk is cheap clause. So, okay, Nicole, keep going.
On that note, is this guidance for conducting new solicitations, or should this be viewed as you should take these steps before engaging with a state contracted cloud solution vendor because it wasn't vetted for these reasons when those solicitations happened?
I would always, when entering into any contract, look at those and go back and talk to them. A lot of the state cooperative contracts were not vetted through this process, though for a lot of state cooperative contracts, they don't have a specific use case. So always use them for the best value, which they are. A lot of the cloud contracts should be being set up for the purpose that they were established and not for the claims that the vendors are later claiming can occur.
I would also encourage you, if you have something that you think is artificial intelligence or machine learning based, something like that, really cutting edge like that, even if you're using it right now, I'd still go back and look at these principles and these questions and get a better understanding of where you currently sit with that system.
Thank you.
All right, so as Chris pointed out, these are really intended for what we would call cutting edge technologies that impact privacy or potential bias or discrimination that have AI and machine learning and that whole category in them. So as Chris said, not necessarily applying to like a generic cloud contract unless, right, it has this component where it's potentially storing personal information. But I'm going to show you here, this is principle 4, rely on objective and repeatable metrics. So we talked about validating claims, but then in the RFP, for example, here I'm going to show you the questions that go with this, right? First of all, are we clear about actually, it finally shows up. It takes a little while. Are we clear about the problems that we intend for the system to solve? So there's some self-reflection as an agency or an entity that's going to procure this. Are we clear what we want to accomplish? How do we solve it now or not? And sometimes the answer is we're not, right? And then how do we measure our own performance that we have currently? And can we share those metrics? And then this notion of what kind of metrics do we want to see? For example, we might ask the vendor to provide us some quarterly metrics or something like that. That we can get an automated report from them on a regular basis, and then some we may need to do ourselves, right? Some we may need to be able to say, okay, we've got a dashboard and we're going to compile certain metrics. These questions can go right in that RFP, or most of them can go right in the RFP. And again, putting the vendor on notice, hey, we expect to be able to measure your performance. And Chris, I'm going to quote you in a conversation Chris and I had. He said, I'm afraid that in some of the contracts we've put technology in place and it never really delivered, but nobody boots them out because it's so much work. And we recognize this process is a lot of work, but the goal is to get high performance, valuable technologies that are also ethical and protect our citizens, right? So that kind of long-term win-win. All right, I'm going to switch back to the principles. So this starts to get pretty deep. Number 5 is to assess threat models. And because whenever you have data gathered together, particularly online, which all of these solutions now are, you are a target for the bad guys, right? And we can think of the SolarWinds set of attacks that were very serious. But we're a state, and so we collectively are a target for nefarious actors who want to steal our data, steal the identities of our citizens, that kind of thing. So there's actually I just will show you this. There's quite a set of questions on threat modeling that works through it. It breaks down what the pieces are, what policies exist on the vendor side, on your side. But it's an important element of how do we protect that data? How do we keep the stewardship of our citizen data that we have? Now, this, for example, is very specific to artificial intelligence. And again, we group that. There's a lot of sub-technologies under that. And this is one where if you are looking at an AI technology, so that might be a facial recognition technology, for example. It could be analysis technology, things like that. AI is very powerful. It can also be very easily misused, and our commission was very concerned about that, very thoughtful and sensitive about that. So here it starts to break down some of the elements that you need to be asking your vendor to explain. What kinds of algorithms are used? They should be able to articulate that. There's a set of them, and it's a finite set. They should be able to tell you. They should be able to tell you how they trained the system. So training an AI system is a lot like training a child, right? We show it lots of examples. How did they train that system? Where did they get the data? And one of the questions is, do you, the vendor, have written authorization from every person whose data is in your training set? Now, I'm going to be candid with you. That is a very high bar. There is a well-known company called Clearview AI. They do facial recognition. They're open, that they scrape social media and take people's data without permission and use it for their training. In Utah, we really had that conversation. We're like, we know vendors like that who are well-known would not be acceptable under this threshold, and yet it's the right threshold, right? It's not acceptable, shouldn't be acceptable to us as a state that people's data is stolen and used to create these systems. We want that high integrity. So the questions, again, for this section, quite detailed, and we recognize maybe you don't all have an AI expert on staff, we get that, but hopefully that will ease up over time. And contact Chris or I if you need some help We don't necessarily have any magic solutions right now, but we just think this is so crucial to get ahead on these issues. And I will just note, by the way, that at the national level, New York City has done some work on this. Massachusetts just passed a law on facial recognition. There's some other work specifically on facial recognition in law enforcement happening at the legislative levels in various parts of the country. New York State is working on something similar to this, and there's us, right? So in terms of setting the bar as a state, we're out there in front. And like John said, I think we're proud to be there because it's important and important for our citizens. All right, and I know we've got a lot to cover, so let me just scroll down here. So this is number 7. Now, privacy compliance, this is a new set of considerations, but of course there's a lot of work happening here in Europe, in California, other states. And so this is really around best practices around privacy. And again, the questions to help you craft an RFP that's really about protecting privacy. And if you've done the work at the beginning, collecting only the information needed, then this one starts to get easier because you don't have excess information that you're putting at risk. All right, any questions?
Nicole, let me throw one thing here. We talk about PII, or personally identifiable information. Different folks have different definitions of what is, let's say, sensitive information and what isn't, but you need to be clear in your own organization as you're going through this, what you consider sensitive and why. So it just helps you understand that. Law enforcement will consider certain things not sensitive that other privacy experts would consider sensitive, but you need to be clear within your organizations what constitutes that PII.
And I think that's a very good lesson, just to know what is going to be PII and letting the vendors know what could go into that system. Because the vendors will claim that if you give them sensitive information, but that was not disclosed either in the solicitation or the contract, they're not going to be responsible in the event of a breach. If you let them know in terms of the information you're going to be giving them, then they're able to adjust accordingly. There are some federal regulations, federal laws, state laws, and follow. And a vendor that is an expert in that information will immediately know what needs to be done and should be able to tailor their response to that. However, this is something that I think all of this information just isn't for the vendors, but as procurement professionals, we should be working with our own agencies or our own departments to let them know this is something you should be considering as you're thinking about implementing a tool as well. Make these principles widely known throughout your own organization so that you can put out better RFPs.
Let me flag one other area just so you're aware of, and this comes to more implementation. There are some entities that will turn over to the vendor to let them access their data systems to pull the information that they want. Well, what they fail to understand is, while it's agreed that the vendor is going to pull this information, they might inadvertently be allowing the vendor potentially to look at other information within the data systems. And so it's really critical that the agency or governmental entity know and control what kind of access is taking place and not just kind of opening it up to whatever the vendor says, well, we're going to pull this, but they might place other stuff at risk, not knowing that.
Yeah, there's a lot on the core computer security side, so we do encourage you to make sure that whether it's DTS or other IT professionals that you work with or IT expertise, that you engage them with this as well, because these implications, these are pretty significant issues, and we really want to protect the systems as well, right? Okay, and so this is 7, and then let me scroll to 8 just a second. Here we go. So this is back to potential discrimination, right? We think it's important to say, look, we want to review steps taken to mitigate discrimination. And this is going to involve some conversations with the vendor. What's their view, right? When you talk about facial recognition, for example, and there's details of that in the questions and some of the other reports you'll see later from us, where we talk about the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, NIST, and they've done facial recognition algorithm evaluation for a number of years. And the reality is that most facial recognition algorithms have significant bias They're less effective with women, they're less effective with the elderly, with children, and less effective with people of color. If you wear a turban or you have big hair, for example, systems fail completely, right? So things that really disadvantage significant sections of the population, and that's just that's the best ones, right? Are really not very good, and so really having candid conversations with your vendor and asking these kinds of questions, and things, for example, the source of data. Right? Might the source of data already include bias in it, historic bias in some way or implicit bias, just where it was collected or how it was collected? And then interpreting the output of their AI model is important. And one of the concerns that our commission raised is even if all the inputs are not biased, sometimes the output still is. And how do you assess that as an agency or an entity that's procuring these technologies? How do they assess it? It's not easy. It's not trivial, right? This is at the cutting edge. But you are at the cutting edge when you're looking at these technologies. And again, set of questions on the other document to assist you in some of these evaluations. I will also note in the questions document, at the beginning, there are a number of definitions to help you. We've put together the best definitions we can find on some of these terms to help you as well. So like Chris says, when you're talking to other people in your organizations. Okay, so number 9 in our principles, determine that ongoing validation. So that goes, back to what are those metrics, and then, okay, what's the process? Put that in the RFP, right? That's a challenge or an opportunity, is to put that in the RFP right up front. Hey, this is what we're going to expect. Here's the metrics, and here's the process. So we are going to keep track of you and of your performance. Are you achieving the objectives? And I think that's important. Number 10 right here, obtain consent of individuals within that training data set. This is very specific to AI, but again, eliminates a lot of players who are well known because they really have not had integrity in how they collect that data. This is a high bar. But the good news is vendors who can't meet this bar, if you put this in the RFP, they'll self-select out. They'll self-select out. Oh, I'm sorry.
Number 11 is vet key vendor personnel. We gave the banjo example, and unfortunately there were some issues that bubbled up there based on the founder's childhood background that only came public later, that caused stress within the public dialogue. And so it's critical that the key vendors, you vet those folks. When it deals with sensitive information, it's critical to have certain background checks and other things like that, and make sure you know what's taking place for those employees that are coming in. You may think that you've got things protected on your side, but if your vendor lets anybody in the door with any kind of access, clearly that starts causing concern. And so you want to know what kind of vetting they're doing of their key personnel.
And John brings up a point here. The commission said, you as an agency may not need or shouldn't see the detail or the output of that background check, but you do need to understand what's the template? What are they looking for? There's cursory background checks and there's detailed background checks. And yes, obviously had some background been understood in the banjo situation, it probably would have not come to a contract. And in fact, many of these principles, had they been in place, and they weren't, right? But had they been in place, many of them would have eliminated banjo potentially from getting a contract. And sometimes that's frustrating. You as an agency, you have a problem you're trying to solve. What if nobody can meet this high bar? Well, maybe it means the technology is not mature enough, or their vendors are not mature enough, or maybe it means we haven't found the right vendors yet. And that's hard, that's frustrating when you've got a problem to solve. But better to wait and to work with industry and to work with the expectations to get a high quality vendor that's, again, going to protect our citizens and their information. And this last one is kind of unusual. Auditor Dougal and I have both worked in the startup space, and many of our commission members had as well. And there is no question that there are plenty of young companies, startup companies, maybe with some venture capital backing, who want to get a government contract as some kind of validation, and they may or may not have sufficient solvency. They may not have sufficient maturity to get the job done. And yet They want to use a contract with the state of Utah, for example, as a stamp of approval. And so this is somewhat unusual. Chris, I don't think this is a normal element of most RFPs, but if a company comes and they are very young, maybe they don't have many big customers, maybe they don't have any customers, they're more in the startup phase, really vetting who owns them, who are the investors, how much cash do they have on hand, looking at those financials, highly recommended, even though it is a little unusual, because there are plenty of companies, frankly, that go out of business. They take some money, and that money doesn't come back, and that's just wasted resources for you and obviously for the taxpayer. So that's our 12. Any questions on that? Feel free to pop in.
One of the things I'm going to just bring up real quick is, well, we use the banjo example. I want to point out, first of all, I appreciated the Attorney General reaching out to me and wanting to have somebody outside his office come review after the fact what took place so they could have some lessons learned. And clearly the lessons learned aren't just for their organization, it's for all of us all across the government in Utah. And as Nicole mentioned, there are various states that are reaching out to us to find out what we're doing, because in terms of these principles, we're on the cutting edge across the nation. And so they want to learn from that as well. And so I want to make clear that the Attorney General's office had a critical mission that they were trying to solve. And they were out on the bleeding edge trying to leverage this technology to help them solve that mission. And it was a very compelling mission and stuff. But there are various lessons we're going to learn as a result of that. But I want to make sure that we all understand this is a learning process. We all have missteps and stumbles along the way, and hopefully we're all learning from each other as we move forward in a stronger, more effective manner. So, Solomon.
Just adding real quickly, thank you for your presentation here, John and Nicole. Very helpful, valuable information shared. And just adding to it, going through these reports, one thing that also stood out to me on my end is applying these principles on into the contract management phase of the entire cradle to grave process. That the task and these questions don't just end once you got the contract in place. Many of our contracts, they include provisions that allow for technology upgrades from the vendor, and that is done, holding the vendor accountable to the same requirements that you held them to get their underlying contract. As they come out with a new algorithm, apply the same scrutiny of what is your algorithm doing, and is vendors have the responsibility to demonstrate that there are not biases included in the output or result of applying their algorithm. Put the burden on the vendor to provide understandable metrics that make sense. We find that vendors may commonly say, well, we take biases very seriously, or we watch for that. But requiring the vendor to demonstrate the how and that result is actually happening was very key in the reports, and in just rounding it out in the contract administration and development phase, from cradle to grave throughout the full process. We do have a question on the board. When has the state used background checks on individuals in solicitations, or is this a new recommendation?
So I can take that. I know that we have used background checks in the past, maybe not as widespread as we should, but I think this is going to become more prevalent as we move on to new startup companies coming towards the state with radical new solutions, is that we do need to be a lot more diligent in knowing who we are dealing with. I think years ago, we pretty much knew Oracle, Cisco, or IBM were going to respond. And in those instances with big publicly traded companies, it's hard to know and run background checks. And I know when we've done background checks before, that's one of the first things that comes out is, well, you know who the CEO is. They're on the cover of every Fortune 500 magazine. We shouldn't be having to do this. But it shouldn't even be a background check on the CEO, but maybe someone that you're dealing with, just to completely understand that they could potentially come across very sensitive data, and we want to know who we are working with. In certain situations, you may just want to say, hey, can we run a background check on people? I know DTS has some background check requirements that vendors must follow in certain situations. And so it's not something that's new. It's probably one of those things that we do need to look for. And this is, I think, one of those things that we can take from these principles and these recommendations is how to apply them. Where can we see successes? Where do we see maybe not necessarily following through with each one, but how do we build upon this? Because like Auditor Dougal and Nicole said, is this was a unique situation. And the first thing that they came out with was recommendations and principles to give to us, not to scorn us or punish anybody, but to really educate us on how to prevent this from moving forward in the future. So I think this is something that we're going to have to look forward to say, what have we done in the past? What are we going to do in the future? And really set Utah apart as being an educated state when it comes to these situations.
And Anthony, there may be situations where the state doesn't run that background check, but we want to know what the vendor is doing as they're hiring, for example, right? So there's a blend there, and I think we can learn from what DTS is doing, Chris. I think that's important. But at the very least, right, if they're dealing with personal information, what's their process? You've got to get in with them and say, are you doing this level of work? Okay, is that all our questions? I think we're good.
Yeah, I think we're good. I just want to thank both of you for hopping on today to discuss this. John, we really appreciate your virtual background in the back of you today. Looks very nice.
Nice picture. I think it was in the office when I came here. I think it's on loan from Heritage and Arts or something like that, the painting collection that the state has.
Well, very nice. We thank both of you. You can stick on if you want. If not, I'm going to ask Solomon to continue with his presentation, and then I'll finish us out.
Thanks so much.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
All right, just continuing on and just wrapping up the discussion here. Another thing that really stood out is the application of these principles to the terms and conditions. As we apply these principles, it's not enough to just say, our terms and conditions address this item, or they address background checks or data privacy and controls. If you look at the application of whatever software system you're procuring and using, having a detailed understanding of what information is the vendor sharing, what information is the vendor collecting, and applying that principle of collecting the least amount of data needed for the vendor to carry out that responsibility, ensuring that is actually happening and how it's happening, and data is shared with the vendor, that it is anonymized where appropriate. And even though it is anonymized, recognizing the data that is provided, a vendor may be able to unanonymize that data. And so as you apply these principles in your procurements in the area of IT, the overarching approach of verifying the vendor claims as they represent to you that they're offering, and in quotes here, AI or machine learning, and understanding what that truly means. In the Banjo context, it was uncovered that they was not even offering artificial intelligence in this standard way that you would understand that to mean. But that was their buzzword that they would promote, and as they promoted their contract to end users and to the state. So going a step further, recognizing the magnitude of a certain procurement or solicitation and the impact it would have on the constituents, the customers that each of you serve through your respective agencies, ensuring that due diligence check is done. But we did post the URLs and the links to both the principles and the questions in the chat here. Would encourage you, if you have not already, do open up those links and download those files to your computer and really assess how they apply to you in the individual procurements that you're involved in on a day-to-day basis. Every principle, every question will not always apply, but depending on the procurement, there are some key principles that will apply as it relates to your IT procurement. So ensuring that is applied where appropriate. But that finishes up our first topic here. And moving on to the next topic, Chris, we just gave you 12 minutes on the updates to the administrative rules. Are you there, Chris?
I am back. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we
Apparently
can hear
my
you
kids
now.
fired up the Netflix. So I'm going to go. So Solomon, you're good. I'm just going to go really quick because I do have a 1 o'clock. And I did want to go over some of the questions that have come in regarding the updates to the administrative rules. First, is Shad on? I want to introduce the new chairman of the Utah Procurement Policy Board if you haven't met him.
Yeah, Shad is on. Shad
I
Brunson
don't
is
know if
on.
he can unmute himself and just say hi so everybody can see his face for a little bit. But in July, there was a change in the Utah Procurement Policy Board. The Jared Gardner, who had served as the longest chairman in history of the Utah Procurement Policy Board, was replaced, which I'm sure Jared's very happy with, to get rid of that responsibility. But he did a tremendous job for us, and we do have a new person that is a part of the Utah Procurement Policy Board. If you don't know who the Utah Procurement Policy Board, it is a makeup of state agencies, cities, counties, school districts, and universities. Hopefully I didn't miss anybody in there. I tried to be very broad, but they're the ones that really meet together to discuss the administrative rules and how they apply. So if you ever have a complaint, a question, you can email myself or anybody else on the board. They are very helpful, and we do plan on meeting. Part of that we will discuss during my presentation. So hopefully my kids do not get on Netflix again for the next 10 minutes as I present. But just as we're talking, there were some updates to the administrative rules in R33. First and foremost, there is a new page where you can find the new administrative rules. I believe this is it. I'm hoping this is it. This is where I go. It's administrativerules.utah.gov. The Utah Division of Administrative Rules updated their webpage and went with a new provider to help house and store and run the process of administrative rules in their search engine. If you search R33, our administrative rules will pop up. So they've moved there. It's also a neat tool because you can see when new administrative rules are coming through. You can make public comment on them very easily in that new system. Legal disclaimer, please talk with your procurement official and or legal counsel before implementing new changes to your processes or policies. This brown bag is intended to be informational and be there for your guidance. I would recommend that you sit down with your procurement teams and just identify whether or not these new rules or changes apply to you and how they do apply. So one of the things that the Utah Procurement Policy Board did was try to consolidate language that was found throughout the administrative rules. When we made changes to the procurement code this last time, we took certain sections of code that were found 4 or 5 times throughout the code and placed them in one spot. And we have done this. We didn't modify the language in these sections. We just took them from their different spots within the administrative rules and put them into one key place. So if you're looking for pre-solicitation conferences and site visits, that's now R33-1-13. Addenda to solicitations can be found right next after it. Rejections for late responses, that's in 15, and voluntary withdrawals. These were all sections already in rule. They weren't changing anything. They were making them a little more broad so that the language wasn't just saying bid or proposal, and applying them to solicitations. And you can find those all in one place right now. One of the things that comes up frequently with me is, what do we do with vendors that are submitting their responses when the solicitation closed? Just as a reminder, R33-1-15 now which has always been in there, states that when submitting a response electronically, vendors must allow sufficient time to complete the online forms and finish uploading all documents before the closing time posted in the electronic system. Solicitation responses still in the process of being uploaded at the posted closing time will not be accepted. And this is a rule that I use quite frequently with protests, is vendors seem to be upset that they were not allowed the opportunity to submit a response. I always let the vendors know that the solicitation was posted for a week and that they needed to submit it within that time and not wait for the last 20 minutes to try and submit their response. So just as an example, I think this is one of the more useful rules that we have. Just always take this into consideration, that vendors can't blame the system for them not being able to submit a timely response. One of the things that changed is the individual procurement item threshold is now $5,000 instead of $1,000. So that's a 5 instead of a 1, unless your procurement official determines a lower amount. And the same goes for the aggregate threshold, going from 5,000 to 10,000. So from a 5 to a 10. And again, it's prefaced with unless the procurement official determines a lower amount. And so what does this mean? Talk to your procurement official. Just because the key in there is unless your procurement official determines a lower amount. And this is where I know I'm going to draw a lot of ire from state agencies that are under the Division of Purchasing, but I have made the determination as of now that the small purchase threshold is $1,000 and the single procurement aggregate threshold is $5,000, because this is what I am determining as of now. So every small purchase for executive branch agencies will continue the same. If you do not fall under my jurisdiction, please reach out to your procurement official to get it clarified on what you would like. I've spoken with quite a few school districts and universities and others, and they're going to remain with the 1,000, 5,000 as well. The reason why we modified the small purchase threshold as the Utah Procurement Policy Board was because, like I said, the policy board is a lot of different, it's a group of 15 people that have different views and different objectives in their procurements. And we wanted to create some flexibility for some of those in that group to allow them to go up to a higher threshold. So with that, for executive branch agencies, I just want to say thank you. Thank you. We appreciate the opportunity to work with you. But second, work with us and we will identify whether or not we believe we can raise your threshold based off of an LPD. So reach out to your procurement liaison from my office and we can start the process of identifying whether or not to raise your small purchase threshold. For those wondering, I take small purchases very seriously. If you talk to anyone, they're going to first say that most fraud takes place within the small purchase threshold. It's the items that are purchased under $5,000 that cause the most fraud, because they're items that can go through a process without much transparency. And so we do want to keep track of those. And that is one of the reasons why I am keeping the threshold at this moment of 1,000 and 5,000 in the aggregate for state agencies. But if you'd like to have your LPD for your department modified, we are going to ask you about examples of purchases that could be made with a higher threshold. Ensure that you are trained on how to still ensure that you're following the procurement code and competitive processes. And then ensure that it's limited, not that we're going to offer too many broad exceptions. But just because we can go up to $5,000 doesn't mean that you should be looking at this as, oh, this makes my life easier. We should still be as competitive as possible with whatever amount the small purchase threshold is. If the small purchase threshold was $100,000, I would say still go through some sort of a process, be competitive, get some quotes, show some value in what we're trying to accomplish as procurement professionals. Just to give you a heads up, most of the other changes were just in alignment with the Utah Procurement Code. I'm not going to go too deep into them, but we did change Chief Procurement Officer or head of a procurement unit with independent procurement authority to procurement official. We removed issuing and conducting. And then we removed a lot of other passive language that was included in the rules. The Utah Procurement Policy Board believed that they clarified some language as well. There's not many, there's no real substantive changes beyond the change in the small purchase threshold. Everything else was minor cleanup that needed to occur based off of grammatical errors or the like. But just as a heads up, as we made so many changes, the Utah Procurement Policy Board is aware that we still need to go back in and clarify some things. So we will have to meet up again. I appreciate all the comments that have come into my office, and we've received them. We will continue to review them and present them to the Utah Procurement Policy Board after legislative session, after we know what other changes are occurring in the Utah Code. Just as a heads up, the only bill that has passed dealing with the procurement code is House Bill 143 with Representative Perucci. This was a transparency issue on emergency purchases, stating that if we have an emergency purchase, we need to publish that emergency purchase within 2 weeks. You can either publish that on your website or use BidSync or SciQuest to provide notification that your agency issued an emergency purchase. Hopefully next week, should be next week, session ends tomorrow. I'll send out an email letting you know the bills that have passed and identify how those bills will be, how those bills will affect us. As always, we continue to strive to be in compliance with law and code and rule, and we want all of you to be that as well. I apologize. If you have questions for me, please send them to me. I have to get off right now for an interview. So thank you so much for attending today. Hopefully you can take as much out of this as I did, and that we can continue to work to become a state that strives to be perfect in its procurements. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here today. I know that you're available, Shad. Will you just do a quick introduction for you?
Yeah, sorry I had to step away. It's been a little bit of a unique day today. But I'm Shad Brunson, and I'm the Director of Procurement Services over at UDOT and the Chair of the Utah Procurement Policy Board. It's a pleasure to work with you guys and work with Chris. He's always been available and ready to help at any time, and he's been a huge help with me. Wendy as well, reached out to her many times in situations, and it's just always, we appreciate it so much that you guys work so hard and are willing to help all of us other agencies out whenever we need some advice or to step in and help or offer your assistance. So we appreciate that.
Thank you for that, Chad. And thank you all for joining us here today. We recognize it's over your lunch hour, so thank you so much for joining us. But that concludes our discussion here today, and wish you all the best day and the best week ahead. Thank you all.